The United States became the first country in the world to use nuclear weapons with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Scientists began investigating the benefits of using rockets to deliver nuclear weapons instead of planes. They were investigating this because rockets were cheaper, they were faster, and they were more difficult to destroy in the air compared to airplanes. However, if you were going to have nuclear weapons delivered by rockets instead of planes, accuracy was a problem with long-range missiles. Long-range meaning missiles that had to travel a long distance. The further the rocket had to travel, the more inaccurate it became. As of 1945, after World War II, the U.S. felt that their main enemy was the Soviet Union. So, as a result, the U.S. wanted missiles that could travel long distances. After World War II, the U.S. concentrated on developing something called Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, which are also known by the acronym Icbms. Icbms were long-range missiles that allowed nuclear weapons to be used by rockets, not planes. So instead of getting close enough to your enemy with an airplane, you could use this long-range rocket, this Icbm, to bomb someone from a long distance. In 1952, the U.S. exploded their first hydrogen bomb. And H-bombs were different than the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan because H-bombs provided large explosions, but with smaller, lighter warheads. And these lighter bombs helped increase the accuracy of rocket missiles. By 1957, the U.S. had developed something called the Atlas missile. And the Atlas missile could travel 6,000 miles and it land within 1 mile of its target. The downside to the Atlas missile, however, was that it would take over an hour to launch. And when you're talking about a nuclear war, that wait time, over an hour, made the Atlas missile less effective. So the U.S. kept developing their nuclear program, trying to make missiles, remember ICBMs, that were more effective and more efficient. In the 1950s, the U.S. developed something called the Minuteman missile. And the Minuteman missile stored its fuel in its own engines, and because of that, it could be fired in 30 seconds. Thus the name, Minuteman. It could be ready within the minute. These were fairly small missiles, and they could be stored in silos underground, protected from enemy attack, which was important. And if you look in this picture here, you'll see this would be like an underground silo where a Minuteman missile could be stored. Another thing that the U.S. developed was something called the Polaris Submarines, and these Polaris Submarines could carry nuclear missiles underwater. Submarines could move close to the Soviet Union and then serve as a launch pad for nuclear warheads. And because they could move close to the Soviet Union, it increased the missile's accuracy. One Polaris submarine could carry more destructive power than all of the bombs dropped during all of World War II. So these were an effective weapon. So the U.S. is making all these nuclear developments. It now can launch nuclear rockets from submarines. They have the Minuteman missile. And the Soviets are watching these developments and they become extremely concerned by the U.S. Now the Soviets were working on a nuclear program of their own. The Soviets exploded their first atomic weapon in 1949. And most Soviet nuclear weapons were very large, and that meant that their ICBMs could travel a long distance. However, because they were so large, their size made them inaccurate, and they were also difficult to conceal from enemies. And one of the ways that the U.S. was able to spot the Soviet Union's large ICBMs was using something called the U-2 plane. The U.S. developed U-2 planes which made Soviet missile sites vulnerable to U.S. attacks. And this is true because a U-2 plane was basically a spy plane. A U-2 plane could fly at an altitude of 14 miles high in the sky, and it would be fitted with cameras. And the plane could photograph and read a newspaper headline from a height of 12 miles up in the air. And these U-2 planes allowed the U.S. to spy on the size and the position of the Soviet warheads. And if you look at these pictures here, you can see there's a U-2 spy plane in the upper left-hand corner. And then down in the bottom right, you can see this is what the aerial photograph from the U-2 plane would look like. The Soviet Union was also very concerned with some of the signs, behaviors, and actions from U.S. President at the time, John F. Kennedy. In 1961, Kennedy announced a program to build nuclear shelters in the U.S. And this showed that the U.S. was expecting a nuclear war. Why else would the U.S. be preparing their citizens for nuclear fallout? Also, the U.S. government distributed pamphlets to citizens on how to survive a nuclear war. And if you look here, this is a picture. This would be the front of a pamphlet. If an A-bomb falls. And all these are signs to the Soviets that the U.S. is expecting nuclear war. Then, in March of 1962, Kennedy tells a journalist that in some circumstances, the U.S. might start a nuclear war. And all of this U.S. preparation for nuclear war made the Soviet Union and their Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, focus more money and resources on developing nuclear weapons. And this is how defensive actions by the U.S. served to heighten the tension and anxiety of the Cold War. And the last thing for this video is this chart. And what this chart focuses on is the amount of nuclear weapons that the U.S. and the USSR had at different points throughout the Cold War. And this chart shows us two things. One, the U.S., in blue on the chart, got out to an early lead in the arms race, in the nuclear weapons stockpile race. The second thing is that while the USSR, who is in red here, while the USSR got out to a slower start, their technology was behind, they peaked in terms of nuclear weapon production later than the U.S. did. And they reached at one point almost 45,000 nuclear weapons, which was over 10,000 more than the U.S. had.